Hello, my friends. Western leaders keep confusing moral posturing with leverage, and they keep mistaking slogans for the hard mechanics of power. For days now, the discussion in Europe has been building around the idea of appointing a special EU negotiator, some kind of Putin negotiator, to represent European interests in any Ukraine settlement. The mere fact this is gaining traction at the European Union level is a confession, not a breakthrough. It's Europe admitting it refused direct diplomacy for so long that it now fears being sidelined in a deal the United States may cut regardless of European objections. And the most telling detail is not the job title or the personality list floating around unofficially. The telling detail is the panic embedded in the rationale. European governments say they fear Donald Trump will stitch up a deal with Russia behind their backs. There is no behind their backs. Trump does what he does in plain sight. He is not subtle, he is not quiet, and he is not interested in soothing European sensibilities. He's transactional, he's loud, and he is predictable. The scandal is not that Trump might do something unexpected. The scandal is that Europe still behaves as if it's entitled to be shocked by the outcome of its own dependence. You can see the strategic trap Europe built for itself. If European leaders believed it was important to engage Russia directly, they always had the means to do it. If Emmanuel Macron wants to speak with Vladimir Putin, who exactly is stopping him? If Giorgia Meloni wants to speak with Putin, who is stopping her? Over the past weeks, both have signaled that contact is eventually unavoidable, not because they suddenly want peace in an abstract sense, but because they're recognizing that Russia is not going anywhere. You don't have to like Russia. You don't have to approve of anything Russia has done. But you do have to acknowledge reality. Russia exists, Russia has power, and Russia answers the door. Europe spent years acting like it could wake up one morning and Russia would be gone, or broken, or somehow magically irrelevant. That wasn't strategy, that was wish casting disguised as policy. Then the same article logic slides into fantasy again. Europe can only maintain its red lines, including Ukraine's potential future membership in NATO, if the EU has a seat at the table. That line is so revealing because it exposes how thoroughly European elites rewrite history to justify today's posture. When did Ukraine's NATO membership become Europe's official red line? The first time Ukraine's NATO track was elevated at that level was 2008 at the Bucharest summit, driven by the United States' George W. Bush declaring that Ukraine and Georgia would one day join NATO, with no timeline. Many Europeans did not share that enthusiasm. Angela Merkel famously understood that for Moscow, NATO membership for Ukraine was not a minor detail, it was a red line. But now, after years of reckless signaling and denial, we're asked to accept that Ukraine's NATO membership is a European red line. That's not leadership. That's a retroactive justification for a policy that helped manufacture a catastrophe. And this is where the personnel talk matters, because it reveals whether Europe is serious about negotiation or merely searching for a stage to posture on. One of the names floated is Kaja Kallas, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and former Estonian Prime Minister, celebrated in Brussels as a steadfast ally of Kyiv and a relentless advocate for escalatory sanctions. In a moralistic press release, that sounds impressive. In real negotiations, it is self-sabotage. Diplomacy is not a purity contest, it is an outcome-driven process. If you appoint someone who is automatically disliked by the other side, you are prioritizing domestic signaling over the ability to produce results. When I first saw Europeans talking about creating an envoy role, I assumed naively that they would choose someone who could represent European interests while still being tolerable to Moscow, someone neutral in presentation even if not neutral in loyalty. That is what serious states do. They pick negotiators who reduce friction, not magnify it. Even major leaders across history routinely send envoys precisely because leaders can be emotionally charged, personally disliked, or too invested in public narratives to negotiate with flexibility. A negotiator must be able to recognize leverage as it exists, not as a press conference claims it exists. Europe's problem is that it keeps confusing zealotry for leverage and rhetoric for power. We've already seen how this works in the American case. Keith Kellogg was discussed in the U.S. context as a special envoy figure, and he has a record of statements that Russia views as hostile. When serious talks happen, the side that feels it has leverage will insist on who is acceptable in the room. If Moscow signals it won't treat certain figures as credible, Washington adapts because that's what outcomes require. Yet, Europe appears ready to make the same mistake the West keeps making, appointing negotiators who exist to satisfy internal politics rather than to reach a settlement the other side will even entertain. Another name floated is Alexander Stubb, often justified with vague claims about a good relationship with Trump and the symbolism of a border with Russia. Fine, but those are not the core qualifications. The core qualification is whether the person can function as an interlocutor without being instantly dismissed, and whether European capitals will accept their authority when national interests clash. And that leads straight into Kurt Volker's most important point. If Europe names a special envoy, who does that person represent, and who do they report to? Those are not procedural questions. They are existential questions for the EU project. Europe wants a single voice, but it does not have one. It has competing capitals, incompatible priorities, institutional rivalries, and an almost religious attachment to the idea that unity can be declared into existence. Even if Brussels creates the role, the envoy will be pulled apart by a simple reality. Europeans do not all want the same end state, and they will not all pay the same price for it. The EU keeps trying to compress a continent into one mouthpiece and then pretending that will generate coherent leverage. It won't. Then you see the lingering rot in European thinking, in the hand-wringing about the right moment to speak with Putin and whether doing so legitimizes his positions. That is the language of denial. This is not about legitimizing anything. It is about acknowledging reality and acting in your own interest. You can condemn Russian actions and still accept the fact that Russia has the ability to shape outcomes. For years, some European officials behaved as if they had all the leverage. Years later, the evidence is obvious. Europe absorbed enormous economic and strategic costs, Ukraine bled, and Russia remains standing with its core objectives still intact. A competent negotiator knows when leverage is real and when it's an illusion. Europe spent years living inside an illusion, and now it's scrambling because it fears being cut out of the deal that will define its security architecture for a generation. This is exactly why the Davos and G7 angle is so revealing. European leaders want to urge Trump to back security guarantees for Ukraine once a ceasefire is in place. They admit that without U.S. approval, it would be impossible to deploy multinational forces promised by the UK and France. That admission is the whole story. Europe cannot implement its own security fantasies without America's consent. And then you get the line that perfectly captures Europe's political unseriousness. It is still unclear what Donald Trump really feels. No, it isn't unclear. If you ask someone the same question for months and they keep refusing or keep dodging, you are not dealing with mystery. You are dealing with a soft no or a price tag. Either Trump won't do it, period, or he'll do it only for a transaction that benefits him in a way he can sell as a win. Trump always wants something. Europeans keep acting as though they can appeal to his conscience or his alliance loyalty and then act stunned when he responds with a demand. And hovering over that transaction is Greenland. Europe is now floating the idea of a negotiated solution that allows Trump to claim victory on Greenland without destroying NATO. That framing is European self-deception. Trump does not want a victory narrative. He wants the asset, the advantage, the ownership. He has said it plainly enough that only denial can interpret it as mere theatrics. This is what Europe failed to do for years. Look west. They obsessed over Russia, treated Washington's guarantee as automatic, and ignored the fact that American politics, especially under Trump, operates with imperial instincts and explicit transactions. If the United States moved on Greenland by force, it would represent one of the largest losses of European-controlled territory in modern history, and it would shred the comforting myth that one for all for one, is an unbreakable law rather than a political choice that Washington can revise when it suits Washington. Europe's current scramble is not strength, it's fear. Now fold in the reports that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff might travel to Moscow this month. Public details are limited, and I won't invent specifics. But the strategic questions are unavoidable. What is the meeting about? Because after every previous contact you hear the same script. Progress, closeness to peace, important understandings. Then the process hits the same wall territory and the realities on the ground. Zelensky will not willingly retreat from the Donbass. Putin will not concede what Russia has secured. Unless Washington is prepared to accept Russia's territorial gains as a settled reality, or unless it is prepared to escalate in ways it cannot credibly sustain, the talks become theater, and that theater is made worse by the credibility problem. At the same time as talk of meetings, figures like Lindsey Graham push sanctions bills aimed at punishing anyone who buys Russian oil. From Moscow's perspective, that looks like negotiation in words and economic warfare and policy. It looks like one step forward, two steps back. It invites Russia to conclude that Washington is either hedging for domestic optics or trying to freeze the conflict on terms Russia rejects. Then you have NATO's messaging colliding with physics. Mark Rutte talks about responding to Russian Oreshnik strikes by urging allies to dig deep for Patriots, NASAMS, and SAMP-T interceptors. But the Oreshnik is described as a hypersonic system traveling around 10 times the speed of sound, with claims of extremely high speed in practice. The system's Rutte lists are not built to reliably counter that profile. Even Aegis, often presented as a gold standard defense system, is decades old and still not a magic shield against advanced hypersonic threats. So when the headline says NATO explains how it will respond, and the response is essentially, send more patriots, what you are watching is an alliance attempting to talk its way out of a reality it cannot engineer away with press releases. Europe's security posture is still fundamentally American. American hardware, American approval, American logistics, American political decisions. Finally, Zelensky's statement that work with Trump and his team has been productive is reassurance theater, aimed at keeping allies aligned and domestic confidence intact. But when you place it next to Graham's push for sanctions, tariffs, and penalties against buyers of Russian oil right before a reported Moscow meeting, you see the contradiction. Washington signals negotiation while sharpening coercive tools. Russia has every reason to treat that as pressure and hostility wrapped in diplomatic language. And if you are Russia, you draw the conclusion that any settlement must rest on enforceable facts on the ground, not on Western promises that can be reversed with a congressional vote or a political mood swing. So where does this leave us? Europe is scrambling because it realizes it may be cut out of a settlement that will shape Europe's future while Europe remains dependent on Washington. It floats an EU negotiator role because it lacks the courage to pursue direct national diplomacy consistently and because it fears Trump's transaction will come at Europe's expense. It begs Trump for security guarantees while refusing to say out loud that Trump is waiting for a payment, political, strategic, economic, and that Greenland symbolizes the kind of tangible concession he prefers. Meanwhile, Russia sits in the posture Europe still refuses to respect properly, a power that can impose costs, absorb sanctions, and wait out Western political cycles. If Europe truly wanted a negotiator, the first act of seriousness would be to select someone Moscow can tolerate and European capitals will actually obey. But that runs into the EU's structural weakness: unity without sovereignty, authority without accountability, and strategy without sacrifice. The negotiator debate is therefore not proof Europe has found strength. It is Europe admitting weakness years too late and trying to manage the consequences of a geopolitical reality it spent too long denying. And now let's take it one level deeper, because what we're watching isn't a collection of separate stories, it's a single system under stress. Europe is discovering the cost of strategic laziness, the United States is behaving like a creditor collecting payment, and Russia is behaving like a state that understands time as a weapon. Start with the EU special envoy idea again. The public framing is that Europe wants a seat at the table. But the real reason Europe wants an envoy is more cynical. It wants a single face to blame when the inevitable compromises arrive. If Brussels can point to a negotiator, then every capital can pretend it fought heroically, and the painful concessions were simply the best we could get. That's why the most important questions are still Volcker's. Who does the envoy represent? And who do they report to? Because those questions reveal the central contradiction. Europe wants a negotiator who can speak for 27 states. But Europe has 27 different risk tolerances, 27 different domestic political pressures, and most importantly, 27 different degrees of dependence on U.S. protection. That is not a negotiating team. That is a committee built to avoid responsibility. And this is why the surprising name rumor matters. Not because gossip is strategy, but because the name they float will tell you what Europe is really doing. If they choose a hardliner, someone celebrated for moral clarity and sanction zeal, you'll know the envoy role is primarily performative, meant to signal virtue rather than to secure a deal. If they choose someone neutral in presentation, someone Moscow can tolerate, you'll know Europe has accepted that the war has shifted from a moral crusade to a geopolitical settlement. But here is the trap. Even if Europe selects a neutral face, the machine behind that face is still Brussels politics, which is saturated with the belief that talking to Moscow is itself suspicious. So the envoy would be sent into negotiations with one hand tied behind their back by European ideological policing, and the other hand tied behind their back by national governments that will second-guess every line. Meanwhile, the United States, Trump in particular, sees this weakness exactly as it is: leverage. Europe keeps repeating rules-based order, but Trump hears dependent client, and clients pay. That's the hidden meaning behind the constant European pleadings for security guarantees. They are asking for the United States to underwrite European promises with American credibility, American hardware, and potentially American blood. But Trump's worldview is simple. If Europe wants U.S. muscle, Europe must deliver U.S. benefit, not symbolic benefit, not moral applause, material benefit, strategic benefit, ownership, access, basing rights, money, trade concession, something that can be measured. This is where Greenland stops being a bizarre sidebar and becomes the central metaphor for the entire transatlantic crisis. Europeans keep thinking they can craft a face-saving arrangement that lets Trump declare victory without actually changing the underlying reality. But Trump is not asking for narrative. He is asking for outcome. Europe's problem is that it has spent years treating American protection as an entitlement rather than a contract. Under Trump, it is a contract, and the invoice is being delivered. Now, watch how European leaders talk around that invoice. They use soft language, finding a negotiated solution, avoiding catastrophe for NATO, allowing Trump to claim victory. That is diplomatic perfume sprayed over a very hard fear that the United States might be willing to break European assumptions about sovereignty if it thinks its strategic interests require it. In that scenario, Europe is helpless, because Europe outsourced not only defense capacity but also the habit of independent strategic thinking. It built a culture that treated dissent and realism as disloyalty. And now it's shocked that it has to negotiate with Washington, with Moscow, and with its own internal contradictions at the same time. This is also why the Davos G7 push is so revealing. Europeans say it's unclear what Trump feels about guarantees. It isn't unclear, it's painfully obvious. Trump will not give unconditional guarantees because unconditional guarantees are bad business. If he commits, he wants payment up front and ongoing leverage. That's why the European strategy of repeatedly asking without offering anything looks so delusional. In any negotiation, when you keep asking for the same concession and you keep receiving no commitment, you either accept the no or you increase the offer. Europe has done neither. It has simply repeated the request like a prayer. Now let's bring in the Moscow trip rumor, Kushner and Witkoff. Even if we strip away the gossip and focus only on the logic, the problem remains. What can the U.S. offer Russia that Russia cannot secure through continued pressure on the battlefield and continued patience with Western political cycles? Russia's position is not built on headlines. It's built on leverage, and Russia's leverage rests on four pillars that the West has never fully acknowledged. First, Russia has demonstrated it can sustain the conflict longer than Western politicians can sustain unity. Second, Russia has demonstrated it can absorb sanctions, while rerouting trade and production in ways that Western planners underestimated. Third, Russia has demonstrated it can escalate capabilities, particularly in strike systems, in ways that expose NATO's defensive messaging as theater. And fourth, Russia has demonstrated that international isolation is not the same thing as being strategically cornered, because most of the world is not lining up behind the West's maximalist agenda. So if the U.S. envoys go to Moscow, Russia will test whether Washington is finally ready to translate words into concrete terms. Not productive conversations. Terms. Territory. Neutrality questions. Security architecture. Sanctions relief that is real, enforceable, and not reversible at the next political mood swing. And here is the key. Russia will not trade away its battlefield leverage for Western promises that have already been broken in the past. That is not ideology. That is rational state behavior. Which brings us to the credibility crisis created by the sanctions talk. When U.S. politicians push sanctions bills targeting buyers of Russian oil, right as envoys prepare a Moscow visit, the message to Russia is simple. Washington's peace rhetoric is not matched by restraint. From Moscow's perspective, this looks like a familiar American pattern. Negotiate with one hand, escalate with the other, then blame Russia when Russia refuses to accept a deal structured as a trap. If Washington wants Moscow to treat talks as serious, it must signal seriousness. And seriousness is not measured in press statements. It's measured in policy consistency. Now layer NATO messaging on top of this, and the contradiction becomes almost embarrassing. Russia calls for Patriots and other interceptors while discussing hypersonic strike realities. This is where the alliance's public posture diverges from military reality. You cannot build a narrative shield against advanced strike systems. You can build a defense, yes, but not an absolute one, and certainly not one assembled by raiding stockpiles and making urgent appeals in parliaments. Europe is discovering that its arsenal is not a sovereign arsenal. It's a patchwork dependent on American supply chains, American approvals, and American willingness to prioritize Europe over other theaters. This dependency is not a secret. The only reason it feels like a surprise is because Europeans have spent years treating dependency as permanence. And this is precisely why Europe's envoy discussion is so late and so hollow. Europe wants to negotiate, but it has not accepted the first requirement of negotiation, the willingness to face reality without moral panic. Reality is that Russia has leverage. Reality is that Ukraine's position is constrained by manpower, logistics, and political exhaustion. Reality is that European unity is brittle because European economies and publics are bearing costs and seeing no strategic payoff. Reality is that the United States under Trump is not a benevolent guardian, it is a power-calculating advantage. And reality is that slogans about red lines mean nothing if you cannot enforce them. So, what happens next? Europe will keep trying to manufacture a process to avoid making choices. It will keep talking about envoys, frameworks, and seats at tables, while hoping Washington solves the problem and allows Europe to pretend it remained morally pure. But Washington, under Trump's logic, will not solve problems for free, and Russia, under a sober calculation of leverage, will not accept cosmetic deals that freeze the conflict without resolving the strategic issues that caused it. That leaves one plausible direction, whether Europeans admit it or not. Europe will eventually be forced to do what it refused to do earlier, engage Russia directly, on terms shaped by the reality of power rather than by the fantasy of moral leverage. That engagement will not be pretty. It will require swallowing humiliations Europe could have avoided years ago. And it will require a negotiator who is not a mascot for sanctions zeal, but a technician of outcomes, someone capable of acknowledging that you can condemn Russia and still negotiate with Russia, because negotiation is not endorsement, it is survival. And here is the final point. Europeans still resist. The longer Europe waits, the worse the terms get. Not because Russia is winning a narrative, but because time expands the gap between what Europe says it wants and what it can actually deliver. Every month of delay deepens dependence on Washington, deepens fractures inside Europe, and deepens Russia's confidence that it can wait out Western cycles. If Europe appoints a negotiator, the question is not the name on the list. The question is whether Europe is finally ready to stop treating reality as an enemy and start treating it as the foundation of strategy. More soon.